This is Jamie Drummond for Good Food Revolution. I am joined all the way from Australia, South Australia, by famed winemaker Tom Shobbrook. How are you today, Tom?
Yeah, pretty good. Thanks, Jamie. How are you?
I am fantastic. It's it's about 8 o'clock for us here, and about nine something for you now in the
Yeah, half
morning.
past nine in the morning, the day after. I think we're a bit ahead of you time-wise
Yes,
over
yes.
here. So,
Fantastic.
um,
Now you are just coming off the end of a rather marvelous harvest, I believe.
yeah, one of the great ones, I think. When you have like rain and cold, slow ripening in a region where it's normally warm and dry, you have this ability to be able to allow fruit to stay outside in the field for so much longer, and you get this beautiful like slow development of or breakdown of acidity and like development of flavor. So the fruit ends up being, if you can keep it safe from disease, it's absolutely delicious by the time it gets to being ripe. And then you have these beautiful, healthy, strong ferments. And the wines, they take longer to become maybe delicious because there's so much tension and acidity there, but they just evolve beautifully in the cellar. And then we'll probably hopefully release those within a couple of years. So they'll have a year in the cellar, probably 6 to 12 months in bottle, and then be released.
Now, you
So
folks in the Barossa are not so used to rain like that. What kind of challenges did it present for you personally when it came to that amount of water falling from the sky?
yeah, a lot of it for us is this year especially was there was so much rain you couldn't actually get into vineyards to put on, say, some teas
Yeah,
or a lot of we use a thing called eco carb, which is a carbonized coconut husk, which helps change
yeah.
the pH on the leaves. And then also in combination with those two things, that you can put copper and sulfur out as well. But you have to be able to get to the plants to do that. And with the amount of moisture around, it was really hard to actually physically get into some of the vineyards because of the moisture. So opening up canopies, trying to get light into plants early, a little bit of leaf thinning where we thought that there was too much leaf around plants, and actually thinning some fruit out to try and get bunches away from touching each other. So a lot more of the sort of delicate manipulation of fruit that I was used to doing in Europe and haven't had to do so much in some of the vineyards here because it's normally dry and they can ripen whatever fruit's on them. So
Very
it
cool.
worked out really, really well, but you needed to get some of that fruit off to actually get it ripe as well, so that the plant could actually ripen that amount of fruit. We had beautiful, strong leaves the whole way through. Yeah, we're actually quite lucky the whole way through the season, and then a bit of dryness towards the end of the season, which was perfect. Cool mornings, sunny days, and not too much humidity around in what we would call the early part of autumn. We normally
Yeah,
get these
yeah.
really heavy dews. That wasn't there either. So the tricky part was the early part of the season to be able to get the teas and sprays on plants to try and get them to keep them healthy in that really early growing season. The later part of it wasn't too bad. So it was really that early wet winter heading into a wet spring that was tricky.
I'll
So
rewind a little bit here and correct me if I'm wrong. That coconut husk application that you use, that inhibits fungal growth but keeps the good insects around, right?
yeah, so all those sprays aren't too bad for insects. It's just a contact spray on the leaf, so it's just
Yeah,
changing
yeah.
the pH on the leaf. We don't use any oils there, so when you start using oil-based sprays or sprays to help fix things with oil in them, insects breathe through their skeleton, or through their body. So it's you're using oils, you start to block their pathways
Yes,
for
yeah.
air to go in, and you
Makes
kill
sense.
the insect. So yeah, the way we were doing these sprays, they're not dangerous to an insect, but they're a fungal spray, so they're used for treating fungicide.
You mentioned your work in Europe. I believe you spent 5 years in Tuscany. But let's go back a little bit further than that to your first introduction to wine.
First introduction. So my family always drank wine,
Right.
and I started to plant a vineyard with them in 1999. we did the preparation in 98, planted in 99, and then in 2000 I moved to Italy, and I lived in Italy for 6 years. So I sort of wanted to go away to make sure that grapes was what I wanted to do.
Right.
I started some work I did a year at university and then left to make sure that I wanted to actually stay in the field of growing grapes. And then I got roped into growing grapes and olives and then making wine as well. So making wine became a way of capturing your year's work in the field. So growing a tomato in the garden, you slice it, put it on a piece of bread, and you eat it with some basil and garlic and oil. Or you make a passata and you've got tomato salsa for the whole year. Wine's a bit in a way like that. You can grow grapes and eat them, or you can grow grapes, make wine, and you can show your journey to friends. They can be like, oh, tasting this, it looks like you had a warmer season, or tasting this, it looks like it did this. And you start a conversation. So rather than writing a diary, you've actually got it in a bottle to carry around and show friends all around the world. So it's quite exciting in that respect. So that's sort of probably what got me more into it. Mum and Dad always had a glass on the table, but it wasn't until we started to plant a little bit of vineyard at home that I sort of got really excited. And living in a region where there was a lot of grapes and I liked growing things, it sort of was, quite a simple way of things coming together. And I had the opportunity.
That was in Seppeltsfield, right?
Yeah, that's when we had a farm at Seppeltsfield still. That farm was sold in 2018. Mum and Dad moved to the beach. And in 2016, we bought a farm up at Flaxman's Valley, my wife and I, which is on the outskirts of it's sort of in the top of the Barossa Ranges and the edge of Eden Valley. I don't know if you've heard of Eden Valley before.
Of course, yes.
Region quite famous for Riesling from this part of the world. So we're living on the ridge between the two. So lots of elevation, whatever.
So what did 6 years in Chianti in Tuscany do to your winemaking brain? What did you learn throughout that period?
Oh, it was funny. When I went there, I was just 18 years old. I didn't know that there was a region called Burgundy. I didn't know anything about Bordeaux and grape growing. And for the first week I'd been there, we sat down and there was a lot of people that had invested in Italy and had these beautiful old cellars that they'd bought, first growth Bordeaux and all these fancy Burgundies for not a lot of money at the time, back in the sort of 70s, early 70s, late 80s, all that period. And they would open wines up and we would get to taste all the amazing wines from producers I had no idea what they were doing. So like I remember drinking some Moutons from the early 70s and some stuff from the late 60s, like 68. And it's like, I didn't know what they were. So I was just looking at them in a light like, oh, this is nice. I like this because it's like this. I had no idea who Chateau Mouton was or Lafite so it was really interesting to develop a palate. My palate was built around trying lots of old stuff and trying lots and lots and lots of Sangiovese because I was living in the mountains in Tuscany. Of course, yes. So, and then you had access to Piemonte as well. So you were starting to see all these great Nebbiolo wines, and it was really before the boom of Piemonte, when Piemonte was still reasonably affordable.
Yeah.
Like I was on a minimum wage working up in the mountains, and you could still afford a porcini pizza with mozzarella di bufala and a bottle of Barolo for dinner. Like that was still like you could get away with that for €60. That's a bargain. Like now it's sort of not quite like that anymore. So. And we don't get a lot. We get access to a bit of that stuff in Australia, but it's a lot of that's getting chewed up in Europe now too. So and you'd find the same at home as well. A lot of the really great producers are just making tiny volumes, so it is hard to get hold of some of those wines.
Was it in Italy you had your first introduction to minimal intervention winemaking, biodynamics, natural winemaking, for want of a better term?
Yeah, it should have been probably with some of the work that the guys up in Friuli, like Stanka Radicon, were doing. It should have been, but I saw those wines a little bit, but I didn't pay enough attention to them. I was probably got introduced to definitely organic farming. And then in the longer I was there, we moved into organic biodynamic farming at Riechner, where I was. And by the time I left, I was still very focused on biodynamics, but we were still adding a small amount of sulfur to wine. It wasn't until I got back to Australia in 2007 and I met a young guy called Anton from Lucy Margot Vineyards.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And another guy, James Erskine from Yalma. I met those guys and another gentleman, Sam Hughes. Sam Hughes was selling wines in a bottle shop called Vaucluse Cellars in Sydney. He's like, oh, we did a tasting with him. We finished the tasting. And he's like, where are you guys sleeping tonight? We go, oh, we're just going to go and sleep in the park. And he said, no, you can't sleep in the park. Come to my house. So he had this little apartment where he lived with his family out in Merrickville. He cooked us this amazing meal. He had these beautiful collections of wines. He had, in his journey, in part of his life, he'd had time to sit at a computer in a wine store and sell great wines, but also research what was happening in the rest of the world.
Right.
And learn a bit about natural wine. And then he said, guys, like, you're doing all this work with growing fruit. Why aren't you making wines without additions? And so we started a few projects together. Natural selection theory was one of those. And then that led us into looking at tasting more wines without sulfur, and then moving away from that addition in our wines over time. So Italy wasn't really that was the catalyst, I suppose, for the biodynamic growing.
Right.
But really, Sam brought it all together by showing us different styles of wine and wines that were made without additions, and like, maybe we could try this. So he really pushed us to, like, a bit like a donkey and a carrot, I suppose, really pushed us to get us to start making wines without additions. And that was really him, and then our stubbornness, I suppose, that got us there. So, and some of the great work that was happening in France as well at the time. You know, we had, by the time we started, there was at least 10 or 15 years of unsulfured wines being produced in France, so that we had reference to be able to look at as well. A little bit in Italy, but mostly in France. So
were there any producers in particular? Were there any producers in particular that you took inspiration from, wines that you still drink to this day and think, damn, I wish I could make a wine like that?
Yeah, I mean, you see the wines from like Thierry Poussillade and Paquelé and things like that. Yes, definitely. I don't see them a lot in Australia. They're here, but they're on allocation, so they're quite hard to get hold of. When you're in Europe, it's like you're like a
kid in a candy store.
In the candy store, exactly. You're just like, oh, bubble it, and they're not as expensive either. So it makes it a bit more approachable to see those things. And when we see those guys at events, when we're doing tastings together, you know, you sit and have a bottle of wine with them, and it's great. You can ask questions, and they've been super open to sharing ideas and things like that. But it's different. Like, the fruit's different everywhere, so we're trying to work out what happens here, what happens in the vineyards where we're working. Some wines we make work really well without sulfur. Other wines become a bit of a mess sometimes. Yes. So it's about trying to learn, like, which vineyards work, which varieties work, and then why don't some of those vineyards or varieties work very well without sulfur? Or how do we change some of the ways we ferment them to try and get those wines to become more balanced and more stable? So, and a lot of it's got to do with time in glass as well. You know, we're just not leaving things long enough. So we're sort of in the process at the moment of moving to releases, hopefully minimum 6 months in bottle, if not a year. And then some, you know, one of the wines we make at the moment, our current release is 2019. So it's had a year in cask, a minimum year in glass. I think we released it 2 years after being in glass. So it's sort of just tickling along slowly now.
That's a huge fiscal investment if you're sitting on that amount of inventory, though, right? It takes a while to get to that point.
Yeah. So unless you start with money, or what we've tried to do is do it slowly. So maybe do a couple of cuvées every year and start to push them out. So also we had a later, again, last year we had a cool harvest. And so you're picking fruit later, you're moving into autumn and winter, the ferments are slower, the wines take longer to evolve. you're bottling a bit later. So you naturally, in those cooler years, you can progress a bit further forward, and that helps you release wines a bit later as well. In some of the early harvests that we've had in the past and some that are coming in the future quite quickly, I think, we'll be picking earlier, but we're still going to give those wines time to evolve in bottle before release so that they are super stable. Like we're choosing not to use sulfur in our wine. So we have to be, and we're trying to work without sulfur in the vineyard. We haven't quite got there yet on a fungal growth theory, but we're getting close by using teas, starting to grow gardens of chamomile and nettle, calendula. They're all going to help us give the plant strength in the growing season, which hopefully means in time we may not need to use those sulfur sprays. So we'll see. We're getting closer each year. So
work in progress.
Always, forever. Like until you're dead, I think it's always a progression of what our ideals are and how that we can always improve what we're doing all the time. So whether that's sourcing a bottle to put the wine into, looking at different closures, farming in different ways, looking after the wines in different ways in the cellar. It's quite a thoughtful process. So in a way, we've taken away that ability to get away with things by not adding sulfur. So we'd have to be very careful at certain periods. And having shit wine in a bottle is not an excuse. Like that's, they make natural wine, the wine tastes terrible. It's like, no, well, they made a mistake somewhere. That's not a reason to have a shit wine. Like they should be expressive and beautiful and exciting. And if they're not, then we've made a mistake somewhere, and we need to find a way to fix that mistake.